That's actually one of the things which was commented on him by some of the literary lions over in England at the time. Mr. Eliot is so serious. And I shared with you last time about his upbringing in Boston amongst the sort of puritanical, buttoned up, respectable religious people in Boston and in Missouri, in St. Louis, where he was brought up. And as a reminder, he comes from a long strain of Unitarian ministers and families, and the Unitarians were a Protestant sect who had moved away from historic, what we call Nicene Christianity, believing fully in the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ, influenced by the deism of the 18th century. The deism, remember, is the philosophy that there is a God but who created the world, but he's out there and he doesn't actually interfere in our lives. He doesn't actually have anything to do with us in the day-to-day life. So they moved away through deism into Unitarianism, denying the doctrine of the Trinity and the incarnation, and basically constructing a form of Christianity which was all about good works, being respectable, being well educated, developing here in the developing United States, developing a good citizenry who were going to be respectable and law-abiding. And this was the kind of ideal of Eliot's family when he's there in Missouri and eventually going to Harvard to be educated. While he was at Harvard, he's a young man who's thinking very deeply about all the important questions in life. And he's realizing very quickly that this puritanical and Unitarian background of his is unsatisfactory. It doesn't go far enough. It's too shallow. Furthermore, he's beginning to have some religious experiences which take him beyond that simple Unitarianism. And I'm going to be reading some excerpts from this excellent literary biography by Lyndall Gordon, which helps us to understand Eliot's mindset and his experiences. It says, at the time Eliot graduated from Harvard, while walking one day in Boston, he plunged into a strange silence like a parting of the sea. In June 1910, he's now 22 years old, he wrote a poem he never published called Silence, his first and perhaps most lucid description of what later he described as the timeless moment. In other words, he experienced a real kind of mystical, mysterious experience. Here's the poem. Along the city streets it is still high tide, yet the garrulous waves of life shrink and divide, with 1,000 incidents vexed and debated. This is the hour for which we waited. This is the ultimate hour when life is justified. The seas of experience that were so broad and deep, so immediate and steep, are suddenly still. You may say what you will, at such peace I am terrified. There is nothing else beside. In other words, he experienced as a young man of 22 some mystical, transcendent experience which his Unitarianism, with all its practicality and all its common sense respectability, hadn't really prepared him for. So at the age of 21, 22, he had an experience which he said many have once or twice in their lives and are unable to put into words. You may call it a communion with the divine, or you may call it a temporary crystallization of the mind. In other words, he said he saw something very clear. He saw something very precise in his experience, and this was going to motivate him to actually drive him forward in his spiritual life, and drive him forward in his poetry, and drive him forward in his religious conversion, always looking for that something that he experienced when he was 21 years old. In that same year, in 1910, as a young man, he goes to Paris. Remember, we talked about that last time, that he went to Paris and he spent time exploring the literature of the French literature of the time and studying at the Sorbonne University, and also began to experience the seamier side of life. You might remember that last week we said that he would, during his time in Harvard as an undergraduate, he would wander through the city streets in Boston late at night. He was obviously looking for some kind of experience, again, which was richer and more powerful and more real than this very kind of sterile, puritanical experience that he had in his boyhood and in his boyhood home. He did the same thing when he gets to Paris. He wanders through the city streets late at night. And as a young man of 21, he's obviously being interested in the nightlife of Paris. He'd been told that Paris was a city of sin, and he was going over there and he was actually, did he have the courage to actually partake in that or not? Or was he just going to actually be viewing the whole thing, you know, and being a voyeur, I suppose is the word. He's going to be looking in, but he's not going to be partaking because he's too cowardly to do so. So he's wandering through the city streets, and there's a description of it here, of his life in Paris, which again is well written. He began to explore the streets during those hours of the night when they were deserted, except for the occasional prostitute or scavenging cat. He, too, was a kind of scavenger, turning over his observations to find some clue to the meaning of life. A rusty spring in a factory yard, the unfathomable eye of a soliciting prostitute, his own eyes peering through the lighted shutters of other people's houses. And in Rhapsody on a Windy Night, he tries out Bergson, that's the philosopher's approach to truth, not by analysis, but by casting himself out onto the reality of life and simply experiencing it and trying to experience what that is like. And a couple of his poems, actually from that time period, actually recount this better than what I've just read. And this is from his poem Rhapsody on a Windy Night, and I'll just read a few excerpts from it. 1:30. The street lamp sputtered, the street lamp muttered, the street lamp said, "Regard that woman who hesitates toward you in the light of the door, which opens on her like a grin. You see the border of her dress is torn and stained with sand, and you see the corner of her eye twist like a crooked pin. The memory throws up high and dry a crowd of twisted things, a twisted branch upon the beach, eaten smooth and polished as if the world gave up the secrets of its skeleton, stiff and white, a broken spring in a factory yard, rust that clings to the form that the strength has left hard and curled and ready to snap. 2:30, the street lamp said. Remark the cat which flattens itself in the gutter, slips out its tongue, and devours a morsel of rancid butter. He's fascinated by this dark, seamy side of life, and he's making connections with all the images that he sees. And you might remember, with all those different images, something we said last week about the clue of how to actually understand and read Eliot. He's actually gathering together lots of different images which he's experiencing and sort of throwing them together in a big mix, and then making connections between those images and other thoughts and other things which are running through his mind. Another poem that he writes at the same time is called Preludes, and I'll read that for you because it's actually quite a beautiful poem. The winter evening settles down with smell of steaks in passageways, 6 o'clock, the burnt-out ends of smoky days. And now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet, and newspapers from vacant lots the showers beat on broken blinds and chimney pots, and at the corner of the street a lonely cab horse steams and stamps. And then the lighting of the lamps. These street lamps are gas lamps, and they have a person going around lighting them every night with a long wand. The morning comes to consciousness of faint, stale smells of beer from the sawdust-trampled street, with all its muddy feet that press to early morning coffee stands. With the other masquerades that time resumes, one thinks of all the hands that are raising dingy shades in 1,000 furnished rooms. You tossed a blanket from the bed, you lay upon your back and waited. You dozed and watched the night revealing 1,000 sordid images of which your soul was constituted. They flickered against the ceiling, and when all the world came back and the light crept up between the shutters, and you heard the sparrows in the gutters, you had such a vision of the street as the street hardly understands, sitting along the bed's edge where you curled the papers from your hair or clasped the yellow soles of feet in the palms of both soiled hands. His soul stretched tight across the skies that fade behind a city block or trampled by insistent feet at 4 and 5 and 6 o'clock, and short square fingers stuffing pipes, and evening newspapers, and eyes assured of certain certainties, the conscience of a blackened street impatient to assume the world. And then he becomes personal. I am moved by fancies that are curled around these images and cling, the notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. Wipe your hand across your mouth and laugh. The worlds revolve like ancient women gathering fuel in vacant lots. So from his wandering in the streets, he's got these ideas and these images, trying to find some meaning that is deeper than the meaning that he was given in his puritanical and Unitarian upbringing. So in 1911, you remember, he returns from Paris back to Harvard. And the description of him in Harvard is that he's now a sophisticated young man taking pictures from the sort of avant-garde painters in Paris at the time and hanging the prints on his wall. He's a bit of a dandy with a Malacca cane, a sort of bamboo cane, and he's posing as the sophisticated young student who's now come back from Europe. And he begins his study of philosophy for his doctorate at Harvard. And at the same time, you remember, he falls in love with Emily Hale. Emily Hale is a woman who would be a perfect bride for him. She comes from the same Boston sophisticated background. She's from a good family. She's artistic. She's a drama major. She is producing plays and directing plays and acting in plays. During this time period, you remember I said that he actually took part in a play with her. And it was a version, I said it was Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. It was actually Emma. And he played Mr. Woodhouse. So if you remember Mr. Woodhouse in Emma, he's an old, cantankerous hypochondriac. It would have been perfect for Eliot because, he was old before his time. So he played Mr. Woodhouse, and Emily played, I believe, Emily played Mrs. Elton, the snobbish, social climbing wife of an Anglican vicar. However, we left it last week by saying, is he going to stay there in Harvard? Is he going to actually take up his role as a philosophy professor, which he would have been prepared for if he completed his doctorate? No, in 1914, he returns back to Europe. He goes to Germany to begin studying at the University of Marburg, but remember what happens in 1914? War breaks out. And so he retreats from Germany and goes to Oxford, where he has a place to study at Merton College. He's fed up with Oxford, and he writes to his friend Conrad Aiken, who's also a poet and a contemporary of his at Harvard, and says, basically, university life in Oxford is just as boring as it is in Harvard. This is not really for me. So in 1914, he's there in Oxford, and he's mixing with some of the wild children in London, because this is just on the verge of the 1920s, remember, and Europe is actually going through a time of decadence and a time of freedom and license amongst the young. And there's a description here of his time actually with some of the young people there in London and in Oxford. This is where he meets a young woman named Vivian, who's a dancer. Dancing, dining, and punting. Punting is going boating in a long flat-bottomed boat on the river in Oxford. Dancing, dining, and punting in the company of others told him little about Vivian. He was a foreigner who until then had no contact with English women. At Oxford, he stiffened in surprise at the sight of women students at the lectures. Vivian appeared the opposite to the Oxford students, women students, and also the women he knew at Harvard and his family, who were all straight-laced and very well behaved. Vivian appeared the opposite to them. She was wild, mercurial, a world apart from his serious mother, his professional women cousins, and the perfect propriety of Emily Hale. As an Englishwoman, she was a mystery to Eliot, who may not have known what to make of her staring eyes and open mouth beyond their challenge. Her impulsiveness, her smoking and dancing, and her eloquent intelligence teased his cautious nature. Not least of Vivian's attractions was her faith in Eliot as a coming poet. So Vivian is this vivacious young dancer in London who's obviously very different kind of woman than the women that he grew up with in Missouri and in Harvard. And he's going out with her, and by 1915, he's not only going out with her, but he marries her. Suddenly, without any of her parents or his parents actually knowing what was going on. And the biographers theorize that she had probably seduced him, and he, being a young man of upright morals and doing the right thing, felt that he had to marry her as a result. And so they were married in a civil ceremony in June of 1915. He described this later as the awful daring of a moment's surrender. So there he is, all bottled up with his emotions. There he is, all uptight from his puritanical upbringing. And he's wandering through the city streets late at night, wondering, does he have the courage to actually take the leap and experience something? He said later in his life, it is better to experience evil than not to experience anything at all. So he was in this kind of bottled up, frozen, emotionally frozen mentality, and he thought, I have to do something to actually live. I have to take a step, what he said was the awful daring of a moment's surrender. So probably he surrendered in fornication with Vivian, and then also felt that he had to make the daring surrender of marrying her. So he marries her with no financial prospects, no prospects of a career, in England, isolated from his family, who obviously disapproved of him marrying a dancer, and also isolated from her family because they didn't tell, neither Vivian nor Tom actually told either of their parents what was happening. They just simply went to the registry office, as it's called in England, and got married. It turned out to be a huge disaster. Okay, it was a huge disaster for a couple of reasons. First of all, she was not only vivacious and a dancer, but as you can imagine, she was promiscuous. Okay, this is on the verge of the 1920s with the flappers. And if you see pictures of Vivian, she had the whole flapper sort of gear with the long sort of dress and the bobbed haircut, which was a scandal back then. And not only was she a dancer, but she was also introducing Eliot to the latest dance crazes in London. Something which was called the grizzly bear and something which was called the foxtrot. He was up on the new dances called the foxtrot and the grizzly bear and could hum the latest ragtime tune, which was called the Shakespearean rag. And the biographer actually looked up the words to the Shakespearean rag, which are, "That Shakespearean rag, most intelligent, very elegant. Desdemona was a colored pet, Romeo loved his Juliet, and they were some lovers, you can bet. And yet I know if they were here today, they'd grizzly bear in a different way. And you'd hear that old Hamlet say, to be or not to be, oh, that elegant Shakespearean rag." Okay, so this was the sort of pop tune of the day. He and Vivian were out dancing and having a great time in London, but it soon turned really disastrous because he had a wife to support. And the wife to support was actually a sick woman. She was addicted to drugs, which had been prescribed for her various illnesses, physical illnesses, but she was also emotionally extremely unstable, and she was what we call the hysterical type. Now, psychologically, the hysterical type is not just someone who is kind of excitable all the time. That's a symptom. There's a deeper psychological illness to the hysterical type, which means they are very clinging. They need a huge amount of attention, and they need a huge amount of love. They need a huge amount of reaffirmation. If you have a hysterical woman who is linked in a bond with a reclusive man, it's a disaster. Now the problem is, very often the reclusive man and the isolated, sort of buttoned up man is attracted to that sort of a woman. Why was Eliot attracted to Vivian? Because she was exciting, okay? She was something he had never experienced before, this vivacious, funny, intelligent, exciting dancer. He was attracted to her. She was attracted to him because he was serious, because he was respectable. And so they were attracted to each other for all the wrong reasons. Consequently, as they got into the marriage and they realized what they'd actually done, and they were living in London in the early part of the century, it's cold, it's dark. They were living in a tiny little apartment, which was probably no bigger than a closet, and they had to share that one room together. The more she began to cling to him for security and for affirmation and for love, what did he do? The more he withdrew. Couldn't stand that sort of clingy, needy woman. The more he withdrew caused her to do what? To cling even more. They were both totally incompatible, although they had this kind of primal attraction to each other. And the marriage was a kind of hell for both of them. It's easy to blame Eliot for not being able to give Vivian for what she needed, but she was also unable to give him what he needed. It was a marriage mutually hellish for both of them. 1 year after the marriage, Vivian, who's very needy, actually has an affair with the famous philosopher Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was in the literary set in London and Cambridge of the time, and they were trying to encourage Eliot with his poetry. Bertrand Russell actually was a very promiscuous and adulterous man who had numerous affairs, and he seduced Vivian while he was also providing an apartment for them to live in. He was very duplicitous towards Eliot and lied to Eliot and basically said, I want to provide this apartment for you, which we will share together. But when Eliot was away, he was actually seducing Vivian. So this affair, actually at the beginning of their marriage, was like a bomb in the middle of a relationship which was already really, really bad. Bertrand Russell then leaves Vivian high and dry and blames Eliot for the problem, and says that Eliot was unable to give Vivian what she needed. Therefore, that's why he was there to try to help. So Bertrand Russell comes out of it as a totally despicable character. As a result of this marriage in 1915, by the 1920, Eliot is at the verge of a nervous breakdown. In 1921, guess who comes to visit? His mother. His mother and his brother. Now remember, his mother is this uptight Victorian-type lady from the Midwest, okay? And the whole idea that her son was going to Paris at all was pretty hard to take. Then when he suddenly goes and marries this dancer and says, I'm not coming home, Mama, okay, this destroyed his relationship with his family back in America. And in 1921, His mother turns up and is obviously not happy with their living arrangements. By this time, Eliot had tried earning a living as a school teacher and not succeeded. Curiously, he is the school teacher at that time of a boy who would later on to become the poet laureate of England, John Betjeman. He's a teacher at Highgate School. It does not succeed. He gets a job in Barclays Bank and becomes a bank clerk, working long hours in the bank, a job which actually suited him because he liked the routine of it. He liked the sort of accounting of it and so forth. But he was earning a living and supporting his wife, living in a tiny apartment, and his mother comes to visit and is obviously displeased with the setup. This launches Eliot into a full-blown nervous breakdown. And his friends encourage Vivian and him to separate. So they separate just only 5 years into the marriage. He goes to Switzerland to receive psychiatric treatment. And Eliot says later, it was that situation in his life which brought on The Wasteland. And when you read The Wasteland, you see that this is the product, Eliot said it was a product of an extremely disturbed mind. He admitted that himself. Some of the, I'm going to just touch on The Wasteland a little bit so that we can actually look at that and you can see a little bit more about this. The Wasteland is a poem of 6 sections. It's a very complex work. And remember, in the email I sent you, I actually gave you a link to a fantastic website where you can run the mouse over any of the things you don't understand. A little window pops up and tells you about it. To show the tenor or the mood of the poem, it begins with this famous line, "April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain." So all the English poets before him had said, spring, April, it's rebirth, it's joy, it's happiness, it's life. Eliot says April is the cruelest month. And it goes on in a similar vein over the next 6 sections, which I challenge you to read sometime if you really want to get into Eliot. The Wasteland is worth looking at and worth spending time on. But in the second section, the game of chess, he actually reflects back and gives you a little poetic picture of what it was like living with Vivian in that apartment. He says, footsteps shuffled on the stair, under the firelight, under the brush, her hair, spread out in fiery points, glowed into words, then would be savagely still. And there's a quote, "My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What? Thinking what? I never know what you are thinking. Think." Then we hear what he's thinking. "I think we are in a rat's alley where the dead men lost their bones." "What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing. Again, nothing. You know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? I remember those are the pearls that were his eyes. Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? But ooh, that Shakespearean rag. It's so elegant, it's so intelligent. What shall I do now? What shall I do? Shall I rush out as I am? Shall I walk the street with my hair down so? What shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do? The water is hot at 10. And if it rains, a closed car at 4, and we shall play a game of chess, pressing lidless eyes and waiting for a knock upon the door. So he's recounting then the frustration of living with Vivian in this trapped in this apartment, both of them in a cage of their own making. So he writes The Wasteland, and the clue to understanding The Wasteland is there in the first section, where he says, "What are the roots that clutch? The branches grow out of this stony rubbish. Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images, where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. Only there is a shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust." So he's actually sort of echoing the Old Testament prophets when he talks about Son of Man, I will show you, and he's voicing a kind of prophetic vision. And this line, "You know only a heap of broken images." That's basically the way he's viewing life. It's a heap of broken images, which time and time again he goes back to and rehearses and puts into poetic form. "There is a shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust." How do you understand those lines? Do you remember what I said last week? That it's not so much what it means literally, but how you actually feel when you hear it. He's drawing a couple of images together, and I'll ask you, what do you mean? What do you feel when he says there is only a shadow under this red rock? The valley of the shadow of death? So a little reference back to Psalm 23. What is the red rock? What does the color red symbolize? Passion, love, death, blood. And what does it mean when he says, I will show you fear in a handful of dust? What's a handful of dust? Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. In a typical funeral, the person would take a handful of dust or a handful of dirt and throw it on the coffin. Okay? I will show you fear in a handful of dust. A pretty powerful image when you put all those things together. And that's what he wants you to experience, to actually experience those images and how they affect you and how they make you feel. And how did they make you feel? Pretty depressed? Well, then he succeeded, okay? Because that's what he's trying to get across. His own feelings communicated to you through this heap of broken images. And if he's able to do that, and he is very successful in doing that, then he's communicating to you the feeling and the emotion that he wants you to feel, because poetry is the communication of emotion. I'm going to leave you to actually figure out the puzzle of the wasteland yourself, okay? Because there's an awful lot there, and it can actually be understood. And I would advise you, most of all, when you're reading Eliot, actually read it, first of all, for the meaning that is there. Very often, the meaning, if you stop to ponder it, is not actually that difficult. And when you come across images that you don't understand, ask yourself how they make you feel, because that's what he wants to actually try to get across to you. So by 1922, he's published The Wasteland, and it makes him famous. He becomes the voice of the lost generation. He becomes the voice of Europe after the First World War, when it was devastated with death, devastated with destruction, and Eliot's Wasteland becomes the voice of a lost generation. Later on, he said about that reputation, I was just sick in the head at the time. So he actually denied that reputation about being the voice of the lost generation. He said, if other people who were unhappy saw themselves in my unhappiness, okay, I'm paraphrasing. I mean, he voiced this much more eloquently than I can say it. Okay, but that was his attitude. That he looked back on The Wasteland and he said, yes, it made me famous. Yes, it was people say it's a great poem, but I was mentally ill and emotionally ill at the time. And if other people were too, and if they saw themselves in it, so be it. The Wasteland is still important for us today, though, brothers and sisters, because if Europe after the First World War was a broken wasteland, a heap of broken images, our society in the West today is even worse, okay? Think of the world that we live in today. We constantly battle, all of us, with a heap of broken images. We see the screen all the time, we see advertising all the time, we see politics all the time, we see fake news, we see celebrities, we see all sorts of brokenness, and our lives are also a heap of broken images. And Eliot's Wasteland, when you read it and understand it, is still a vital poem for society now 100 years later, because it was published in 1922. Here we are 100 years later. The Wasteland is still a vibrant and a powerful poem speaking to our age today. Well, this takes us up to 1922. His marriage is a wreck. It's caused him to have a nervous breakdown. He's alienated from his family. He's living alone in London with this horrible woman, and she can't stand him either. She's been unfaithful. He is a pretty unhappy man. During this time, he continues to explore, however, that experience he had back in Boston when he was 21 years old, the experience of mysticism. Lyndall Gordon, his biographer, actually went through and discovered the books that he was reading while he was an undergraduate at Harvard. I mean, her research is amazing. She went and found the card catalogs for these books with his signature signing them out. And he was reading heavily in all of the books of, well, I can actually share with you some of the books he was reading. The Psychology of Religious Experience, The Philosophy of Religion in England and America, Christian Mysticism, Personal idealism and mysticism, studies of English mystics, the varieties of religious experience, the introduction to the history of religion, studies of mystical religion, Heraclitus, the psychology of religious belief, religious philosophy, the Spanish mystics, the psychology of religion, mysticism, practice and science of religion, a study and method of comparative religion. So even as an undergraduate, when he was a young man in his 20s, he was reading about mysticism, mystical experience, and studying the mystical authors in Catholicism, but also studying the mystical philosophy of the East with Buddhism and Hinduism. And all of this echoes down into his poetry and his interests. So by 1927, he's now been married for just over 10 years. The marriage is a disaster. In 1927, he finally takes the step that he'd been contemplating for a long time. He's baptized. He is friends with a guy called the Reverend William Force Stead, who was an Anglican priest. And in June of 1927, Eliot goes with Father Stead to a country church in Oxfordshire, and he's baptized privately. The priest locks the door and baptizes him. The next day, he's taken to the Bishop of Oxford, the Anglican Bishop of Oxford, to be confirmed. And in the spring of the following year, he makes his first confession. Now, I need to explain a little bit about Anglicanism and Anglo-Catholic worship, because as Catholics, we say, oh, Eliot remained an Anglican, he never became a Catholic. But in the 1920s and the 1930s, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, was actually going through a time of great renewal, in which after the First World War and the disenchantment and the atheism that came out of the First World War, the Anglo-Catholics were on the rise in England. And the Anglo-Catholics are a branch of the Anglican Church which consider themselves to be Catholic. Their liturgy is very Catholic. Their beliefs were very Catholic. They honored the Blessed Virgin Mary. They had confession. They had a high view of the Eucharist. And the Anglo-Catholics were very popular and very strong in England in the 1920s and 30s, right in the years between the two wars. So Eliot declared himself to be an Anglo-Catholic. He was baptized by an Anglo-Catholic priest, and he called himself an Anglo-Catholic. He was very influenced by the Anglo-Catholic writers of the 17th century, Lancelot Andrewes and the others. In the 17th century, the 1600s, England had gone through the Protestant Reformation under Henry VIII, and they had begun to swing back towards Catholicism. So there was a swing back in the 1600s to a form of Catholicism within the Anglican Church. And Eliot read heavily in the authors from that time period and was very influenced by the Anglicans of that time period and joined the Anglo-Catholic Church. The Anglo-Catholics were, as I say, a branch of the Church of England. And he became a very devoted and committed Anglo-Catholic. He joined his local church in London. He became the church warden, which was like one of the leading laymen in the church, almost like a deacon. And he began a life of prayer and penance, deeply regretting his youthful mistakes. And out of this comes his first confession in 1928. He then also begins to declare himself publicly as a Christian and as an Anglo-Catholic. And his conversion sent shockwaves through the literary world of England at the time, because he was part of the modernist sect set in England with Virginia Woolf and all those people who were basically atheists and non-Christians and modernists. He was a modernist in his style of poetry. That's why they loved him. And then when he became a Christian, and not only a Christian, but a conservative Christian and an Anglo-Catholic, they felt like he was a traitor. He was pilloried in the press as being a traitor, and it was kind of like, this is the modern age, this is our modernist poet. What is he doing going back to that antiquated religion of Catholicism? Nevertheless, he took a strong public witness in being a Christian and being an Anglo-Catholic. And it is out of this experience that he actually writes and publishes the poem Ash Wednesday in 1930. During the papacy of Leo XIII, the end of the 19th century, some of the Anglicans and the Anglo-Catholics went to the Pope and said, could you please we think that we have valid orders. The reason that Pope said no was basically at the Reformation, the Anglican orders were invalidated. And Pope Leo XIII set up a commission to study the question and ruled that the Anglican orders were utterly null and completely void. So that's the official version, that yes, they do things in a Catholic way, and yes, we have some connections with them, and we value the fact that they want to do things in a Catholic way, and so that's the verdict. See, the Anglo-Catholics will dispute that verdict and say, no, we are actually Catholic. Our orders are valid, and we do things in a Catholic way. We believe Catholic doctrines. And Eliot would have subscribed to the view that the Anglo-Catholics were the Catholic Church in England, and that they had restored Catholicism after the Reformation by becoming Anglo-Catholic, even though they weren't in submission to the Pope. That's a view that a lot of Anglo-Catholics will still hold today, even despite the widespread apostasy in the Anglican Church. They would still hold that they're Catholics and that they're the true inheritors of the Catholic faith in England, but it's a fiction. Also, in Eliot's day, and when we talk about Lewis, we can see that actually it was far easier to uphold and to believe that version than it is today. The Anglo-Catholics were actually at that point believers in the historic faith, and they could argue that they were actually upholding the historic faith in England. The Anglican Church is the Church of England, and it has three basic branches. The Anglo-Catholics, the Evangelicals, which are very Protestant and virtually Presbyterian in their thinking, and then the Middle Church, who try to hold the two together, who are basically your typical mainstream Protestant liberals. And there's a lot of fluidity between those categories. So you'll find some of the broad church people in the middle who do things in a very Catholic way and would call themselves Anglo-Catholics, but theologically they're very liberal. And you'll find some evangelicals who have a lot of time they'll say, oh, I really enjoy Catholic spirituality. And so while they're basically Presbyterian in their doctrine, they will wear Catholic vestments and go on retreats and so forth and so on. So there's a lot of mix between them. Do they believe in the Eucharist? They would say they do. However, the problem with that is that to be ordained as an Anglican priest, you have to publicly sign an affirmation of the 39 Articles of Religion, which were written by Thomas Cranmer in the 16th century. Okay? And the 28th Article of Religion says something like this in 16th century language: the doctrine of transubstantiation is a vain thing, fondly imagined, and it must be repudiated by all right-believing Bible Christians, kind of thing. So if you're an Anglican priest, you have to have publicly repudiated transubstantiation. Now they get around this by actually saying, you know, we believe in the real presence. But the real presence is a term which is a flexible friend, okay? I mean, I've heard Baptists say they believe in the real presence. And what they mean by that is, I feel closer to Jesus when we have communion. We're going to look at Ash Wednesday just very quickly. And this is his penitential poem. He's written this 3 years after his conversion. Because I do not hope to turn again, because I do not hope to turn, desiring this man's gift and that man's scope, I no longer strive toward such things. Why should the aged eagle stretch its wings? Why should I mourn the vanished power of the usual rain? Again, he's a young man, but he's taking on this persona of being an old man who's quite world-weary, and he now has made his decision, and he doesn't hope to turn again. He's turned once to Christianity, not going to turn again. Because I do not hope to know the infirm glory of the positive hour, because I do not think, because I know I shall not know, the one veritable transitory power, because I cannot drink there where trees flower and springs flow, for there is nothing again. Because I know that time is always time, and place is always and only place, and what is actual only for one time and only for one place. Now this puzzling language about time and place will come up again when we look at the four quartets next week. He's great on pondering the nature of time and the nature of reality. And this transitory power, the one veritable transitory power, that's the experience of the divine that he had when he was in his early 20s. He says, I don't expect to have that experience again. I'm basically going to just live in the present day, live in this present time right here, focusing on what's real, and get on with actually following the Lord and being a Christian. I rejoice that things are as they are, and I renounce the blessed face, and I renounce the voice. This is his personal experience of this mystical experience that he had. He's renouncing that because I cannot hope to turn again, Consequently, I rejoice, having to construct something upon which to rejoice. This is a very important little couplet. I rejoice, consequently I rejoice, having to construct something on which to rejoice. In other words, this Christian faith which I've got now, I'm going to build gradually, step by step, and put it all together so that it'll actually give me the meaning to life that I've been searching for. When it comes to section 2, here's a puzzling section. Lady, 3 white leopards sat under a juniper tree. In the cool of the day, having fed to satiety, that means satisfaction, on my legs, my heart, my liver, and that which had been contained in the hollow round of my skull. And God said, Shall these bones live? Shall these bones live? And that which had been contained in the bones, which were already dry, said, chirping, Because of the goodness of this lady, and because of her loveliness, and because she honors the Virgin in meditation, we shine with brightness. What on earth does that mean? 3 white leopards sat under the juniper tree. The Holy Trinity and the cross? No, actually, Eliot's very influenced by the poetry of Dante. Okay, and in Dante's Inferno, in the first section, there are 3 animals, okay, which come and besiege the poet as he goes through hell. The first is a wolf, the second is a lion, and the third is a leopard. Okay, and the wolf represents the ravening beast of power. The lion represents the ravening beast of lust, of violence, and the leopard represents the violent beast of lust. Okay, and so why are there 3 white leopards if it represents lust? The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Okay, so he's saying these are the 3 things which beseeched me and made me depressed. Where does the juniper tree come from? You Bible Christians, remember your Old Testament stories. Who sits under a juniper tree? Elijah. When he flees from Jezebel and goes out into the desert, do you remember? And he's depressed and he says, Lord, I'm fed up. I've had enough. He's there sitting under the juniper tree. Now, the juniper tree is a tree in the Middle East which is actually an evergreen which can survive the desert heat. So the poet is basically giving an image that he's been besieged by the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Like Elijah, he's the prophet in the wilderness sitting under the juniper tree, which is a symbol of being evergreen and surviving the desert heat. But so what? What does he actually want you to feel when you hear that? There are 3 white leopards sitting under the juniper tree. Do you know what Eliot said about it? He gave a lecture to some schoolgirls in America on one of his trips to America, and one of the girls said, Mr. Eliot, what does it mean that, lady, there are 3 white leopards sat under the juniper tree? You know what he said? He said, it means, lady, 3 white leopards sat under the juniper tree. In other words, how did it make you feel? Okay? Did it make you feel strange and disturbed and a bit upset? Well, then he succeeded. That's what he wanted you to feel. He moves on with a beautiful section here about the lady who inspires him. Lady of silences, calm and distressed, torn and most whole, rose of memory, rose of forgetfulness. Exhausted and life-giving, worried, reposeful, the single rose is now the garden where all loves end, torment of love unsatisfied. The great torment of love satisfied, end of the endless, journey to no end, conclusion of all that is inconclusible. Speech without word and word of no speech, grace to the mother for the garden where all love ends. He's got a conflict about love in his life, right? What is the love that was satisfied? Vivian. There's another love that is unsatisfied. 3 months before he writes Ash Wednesday, before his conversion and baptism into the church, he gets a letter from someone in America. Who was it? It was Emily Hale. Okay? After all those years, she knew that he went to England, that he had this disastrous marriage, because she's been in touch with his family. She writes to him, okay? And a correspondence begins between them, and a friendship is renewed between them. He's now caught in this loveless, horrendous marriage to Vivian, and this woman from his past, who he was in love with as a young man, writes him a letter and begins a correspondence. So, in this passage about the lady in the Ash Wednesday, remember, Emily has just come back into his life. And remember, he's very inspired and driven by the poetry of Dante. Do Do you remember the figure of Beatrice in Dante? Dante is a poet who's inspired by the beauty of this young woman, a woman who he never marries, a woman who always remains as a kind of beautiful ideal for him. Beatrice, for Dante, is an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the love of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the power of the Blessed Virgin Mary to actually inspire his life and bring healing and wholeness to his life. So as you read back through Ash Wednesday with his poem of repentance, he's also contemplating his failed love of Vivian and the failed marriage, and the fact that Emily Hale has just come back into his life. And so all of these things are turning around in his mind and in his heart when he writes these beautiful words of repentance. And we'll skip to the end here. In the third section, at the first turning of the second stair, and then at the second turning of the second stair, and at the first turning of the third stair, he's echoing back to Dante's Purgatory, which is all about climbing the stair, and it's a circular stair which is leading up to heaven. And in each one of those stairways, another stage of repentance has to take place. And this is brought out in some of the writings from the 17th century that he was studying at the time. In the fourth section, who walked between the violet and the violet, who walked between the various ranks of varied green, going in white and blue, in Mary's color. There, a specific reference to Mary. Talking of trivial things, in ignorance and knowledge of eternal dolor, who walked among the others as they walked, who then made strong the fountains and made fresh the springs. So he's pulling from nature imagery, pulling from the Blessed Virgin Mary, from Beatrice, and from the women in his own life. His mother, Vivian, Emily, who's come back into his life, and drawing it all together with a real sense of renewal and spiritual renewal in his poem of repentance. And we'll skip to the end here. In the sixth section, a beautiful ending. This is the time of tension between dying and birth, the place of solitude where three dreams cross between blue rocks. But when the voices, shaken from the yew tree, drift away, let the other yew be shaken and reply. A yew tree is a pine tree which grows, an evergreen which grows typically in English churchyards, graveyards, as a sign of rebirth and resurrection. Blessed sister, holy mother, Spirit of the fountain, Spirit of the garden, suffer us not to mock ourselves with falsehood. Teach us to care and not to care, teach us to sit still. Even among these rocks, our peace in his will. And even among these rocks, sister, mother, and Spirit of the river, Spirit of the sea, suffer me not to be separated, and let my cry come unto thee. Beautiful line there. Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still. What does that mean? He's being drawn to the contemplative life, okay? He wants to return to that experience he had as a young man, to try to have an experience of contemplation, an experience of detachment. Teach us to care and not to care. In other words, to care about the stuff that's really important, but not to care about the stuff which is not important. Teach us to care and not to care, to be detached. Teach us to sit still. In other words, in the hurly-burly of life, he's going to seek the contemplative life. Later on, as we'll look at next week, in his later stages of his life, he actually lives as virtually a celibate recluse. Okay? Remember, he's interested in mysticism. He's living with another man who is who he actually helps to look after, who's an invalid. And he's living in a small room, in the back room of an apartment, and a very interesting conversation develops. The guy who shares the apartment with has a cleaning lady who's a Spanish cleaning lady who's a Catholic. And by this time, Eliot is very world famous and so forth. And someone says to her, "What is it like living with the poet?" And she says, "Poet?" And they describe what Eliot looks like. And she says, "Oh," she says, "you mean the holy man." In the middle of Ash Wednesday, there's two Italian words which refer back to a quote from Dante, and the words are "sovegna vos." And "sovegna vos" basically means "be mindful." Be mindful. And in the full quote from Dante, which those two words are referring to, the translation is "be mindful in due time of my sorrow." So Eliot is making a public declaration of his faith in Ash Wednesday, and he therefore goes on to write some important Christian poetry after that, and he then also shifts over to writing drama. because he thinks that in drama he's going to be able to communicate the Christian faith more effectively to people than just with poetry. I use Puritans and Unitarians because the Puritans were the ancestors of the Eliot family in New England when they first came, like the Pilgrim Fathers. And Unitarianism is a sort of departure or a growth out of Puritanism. But it's the same sort of Protestant mentality, very strict, very legalistic, very respectable. The Unitarians have now become the Unitarian Universalist Church, okay? And they're basically this kind of mentality taken to the extreme, okay? They're very woke, for instance, okay? And they would not hold to Christian doctrines, although they would still call themselves a Christian church. Absolutely. As he brought up as a Unitarian, he would have been ignorant of the whole concept of grace, and he is very much taking on a Catholic understanding of these things, step by step, and realizing that repentance is the first step, and Ash Wednesday is the first step of repentance. We're going to look very quickly now at the Journey of the Magi, which is one of the poems called the Ariel poems, which he wrote in the years after his conversion. Here his poetry is much easier to understand, okay? He's trying now clearly to move away from the puzzling poetry with lots of images and with lots of arcane allusions to Greek philosophy and to Italian poetry and to German literature and all the stuff that you find in the wasteland. He's trying to communicate much more simply the Christian faith and his belief as it now stands. And we'll just go through this very quickly. You can read through it. A cold coming we had of it, just the worst time of the year for a journey, and such a long journey. The ways deep and the weather sharp, the very dead of winter. And the camels, galled, sore-footed, refractory, lying down in the melting snow. There were times we regretted the summer palaces on slopes, the terraces, and the silken girls bringing sherbet. And the camel men cursing and grumbling and running away. He's talking about the wise men actually making their journey to Bethlehem. In the end, we preferred to travel all night, sleeping in snatches, with the voices singing in our ears, saying that this was all folly. And he's using the journey of the wise men as a metaphor for his own spiritual journey. He also is making this journey from his country, making a long journey to the Christ child. And then he has these images. At dawn we came down to a temperate valley, wet below the snow line, smelling of vegetation, with a running stream and a watermill beating the darkness, and 3 trees on the low sky, and an old white horse galloped away in the meadow. Here's a perfect example again of how did those images make you feel? What are the 3 trees on a low sky? Maybe the 3 crosses? What about an old white horse galloped away in the meadow? So, how did you feel with that image of an old white horse galloping away in the meadow? Freedom, and who does that horse belong to? Is it a dead king? Was it an emperor's horse? A white horse is a sign of victory. Why was he galloping away? Where was he galloping to? Okay, there's this sense of mystery that comes in here and the sense of confusion, which is the way he wants you to feel. Okay, that's why he wrote it in there. And that's the sign of Eliot's genius, that he was able to capture something like an old white horse that galloped away in the meadow, and he thought, I know how that makes me feel. It'll probably make other people feel this way too. So he puts it in the poem. We came to a tavern with vine leaves over the lintel. What does that mean? I don't know. But a vine is a symbol of wine, okay, and wine is a powerful symbol. 6 hands at an open door, dicing for pieces of silver. Well, who was throwing dice? The soldiers at the crucifixion. And who was giving pieces of silver? Judas got pieces of silver, okay? So he's using these allusions and these symbols to spark in your mind certain other much bigger images and much bigger events. Anyway, he goes through and he finds the Christ child, and he says, was there a birth or a death? There was a birth, certainly. We had evidence and no doubt. I had seen birth and death, but had thought they were different. This birth was hard and bitter agony for us, like death, our death. We returned to our places, these kingdoms, but no longer at ease here in the old dispensation, with an alien people clutching their gods. I should be glad of another death. What kind of death is he talking about? It's the death of his old life. He's found the Christ child, and he's found faith, and he's found life. He says, we had found a death, but we also found a life. And he says, I would be glad of another death like that, a death in which I had found new life. So we're going to leave Eliot there. The drama of his life continues next week, and Emily Hale makes a personal appearance.